this conflict with Iran has been going on for a few weeks now, but there's been lead up to it for a while. And for a long time, you were pretty remarkably silent on the topic just because you've been such a large public voice about Israel over the last few years in particular, though, of course, it's been much longer than that. So what is it that's changed recently that has made you more willing to have conversations about the topic in public?
Well, in general, I abide by the dictum of Chairman Mao Zedong, who once famously said, "No investigation, no right to speak," which in contemporary language would be, if you don't know what the F you're talking about, then shut the F up. And there were two aspects which the question of Iran, in which I had a gap in my knowledge, a significant gap. Number one, the history. I've not studied Iranian history, either ancient or modern. I knew, of course, I've read about it. A person of the left, of course, knows the 1953 coup, knows the Savak, knows the 1979 Islamic Revolution. But that was just a person of general knowledge, a generally literate person, their knowledge. So that was one reason that deterred me. And the second reason was the conflict quickly just turned into military analysis. There was very little in the way of, if you follow the social media, there was very little in the way of political background or the sorts of questions that normally concern persons in this particular case. Like a typical question would be, was this a legal war? Was it just? That's always a fundamental question, whether it was a war of aggression or whether it was a war of self-defense. And remarkably, in this case, this is probably the most brazen, flagrant, outrageous breach of the UN Charter ever. But still, that was almost never even discussed. It was simply marginalized, that question. I'm old enough to remember. Of course, I don't go that far back. But even, by the way, even the American Civil War, Lincoln waited for South Carolina to fire on Fort Sumter, that he wanted to be able to claim that he was acting in defense of the Union, that they initiated the conflict. So even as far back as the Civil War, there was a concern about who initiates the conflict and who then bears responsibility, legal culpability for instigating the conflict. To bring it much more up to the present, even Hitler in 1939, he staged a Polish aggression before invading Poland. Of course, it was staged, it was fake, but you have to do it to gain a degree of legitimacy. And then you had, those far back, here we get closer to the modern era, but not you. In order for the U.S. to escalate its war against Vietnam, it required what was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where it was claimed that North Vietnamese boats attacked an American ship. And the Gulf of Tonkin, everybody from the Vietnam War era remembers. That was a critical turning point in legitimizing the U.S. intervention in Vietnam. So, and you take the 1967 Israel-Palestine War, I take that back, Israel-Arab War, 1967. If you take 1967, there's literally a scholarly literature, that can fill a good-sized room on whether or not Israel had a right of self-defense when it launched what it called its preemptive attack on Egypt. And as I said a moment ago, it's the subject of a huge literature, huge. I've written about it. the question of who was responsible, legally culpable, for initiating the June 67 war. This time around, there was no discussion. And you know why? Because there was no debate. Israel and the United States were totally in breach of Article 2 of the UN Charter and didn't have a leg to stand on for Article 51, the Article of Self-Defense. Because Article 51 says you only have the right of self-defense in the event of an armed attack. In the event of an armed attack. Now, there's been some debate. Lawyers like to weigh in on trivial topics. There has been some debate of whether you have the right of self-defense in a preemptive attack. Preemptive meaning the other side has already, say, launched missiles, or planes were en route and they couldn't be turned back, because if they could be turned back, you did not have a preemptive right. But if the missiles were already launched or the planes were en route and their plans couldn't be reversed, then maybe you have a preemptive right. None of that applied to this situation. This was a clear breach of Article 51, a clear breach of Article 2 of the UN Charter. And because it was such a blatant, flagrant, outrageous breach of the UN Charter, I don't believe there's, not even Putin, you can't say it was comparable. If you ask me, I'll explain why. But you can't say it was comparable to what Israel and the US did on February 28th. And this is all a circuitous way, but I believe informative way, of saying that since the political background was completely marginalized in all of the coverage of this situation, it quickly became reduced to the military side. And I have no military expertise. I freely admit to that. Happily, actually, I admit to it. And so there was no place for me, except, if you're obsessed by likes, views, and shares, and you like to see yourself on the social media, you're a narcissist. And I'm not. I have a very strict credo that you don't go on the program unless you have something to say that is that makes a contribution, not to repeat, obviously, and not to endlessly speculate like a pundit, but if I have something substantial to say, and I didn't feel I did until recently, and therefore it wasn't cowardice. Believe me, I follow everything very closely, and I'm prepared to make an infinite number of declarations condemning the war of aggression against Iran. But it was because I'm constitutionally averse to windaggery.
Well, one of the things that I love most about speaking with you, I mean, I've been to your home, so I know that those books aren't just for looks, that a lot of them are like dog-eared beyond recognition, and I'm sure that you've got like a pile of notes and recent things you've been reading beside you. So I appreciate that right at the outset you got into Article 51 and Article 2 of the UN Charter. And what you said, you told us what Article 51 says and why it's safe to say that the US and Israel violated it. But can you clarify what Article 2 says and why that doesn't apply to this situation?
Because Article 2 says you have to exhaust all diplomatic means for resolving a conflict, because there's a principle of the whole purpose of the UN was trying to eliminate the scourge of war. And so you're supposed to exploit all diplomatic options. And Iran And this is not even disputed. That's the funny thing. Has anybody stepped forward and said that the Omanis were lying? The Omanis were the interlocutors between Iran and the United States. Has anybody stepped forward to say the Omanis were lying when, after the attack, they said the Americans and the Iranians were very close to resolving the conflict? I followed the coverage very closely. I'm not aware of any single individual who, except of course Trump himself, who has claimed that the Omanis are lying. So if there was a diplomatic solution, then Article 2 says you can't resort to war. You have to exhaust all diplomatic, peaceful means of resolving the conflict.
You said that you're prepared to make, I think, something like an infinite number of statements condemning
And
war and aggression.
I refrained from it because I thought it would be too bombastic and too grandiose and too self-important. And so I said, no, I'm not going to do it. I actually wanted to go to the UN. I'm at a venerable age. Or as Professor Chomsky, his wife, Carol, once Professor Chomsky started, at a certain age, he started to get all these honorary degrees and so forth. After his entire adult life being he was canceled, to use current language. He was canceled everywhere except obviously his professional life as a linguist. And Carol said, and then he started to get a lot of recognition at a certain point. And Carol, his wife, so we pondered why all of a sudden he's getting all this recognition. And she said, at a certain point, even the most radical of people, they become venerable. You reach an age where they think, you're all white haired and you're sagging in all different places. So they don't fear you anymore. And so you reach a point of being venerable. And I'm at the venerable age already, though I still haven't gotten any awards. But I'm at the venerable age. So I was trying to communicate through intermediaries with the Iranians because I wanted to speak at the UN. Sort of what he's obviously in a much higher level than me, what Jeffrey Sachs has done. I don't know if you follow the UN proceedings, but he's been called in as a civil society witness. And he's actually been by far the most radical, the most aggressive in his presentation. I would have been willing to speak if the Iranian ambassador had ceded his time to me, CEDED, ceded his time to me. I would have done it. But otherwise, and I would have taken it very seriously. It's a serious responsibility. We're in a war. And we could be for the moment, as of we're recording, it doesn't look it, but tomorrow we can be back in a place that's could be terminal. There have been serious concerns registered about whether this time around the nuclear threshold is going to be crossed. And you're a person of science. You're a very smart guy. I know. Dr. Postal, Professor Postal, Ted Postal at MIT, who's a very respected arms expert and very knowledgeable when it comes to physics and ballistic missiles and things like that. I watched a sobering, I won't say chilling, that's a cliche. I watched a sobering interview with him. And remember, he's a senior professor at MIT. We're talking serious business. And he twice in the course of the interview, and he tends to be very professional and very cool and objective, i.e., well, I'm not cool. I am cool and objective, but I won't call myself professional. He said twice, he said that Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'm quoting him, is a homicidal maniac. And that he said something which maybe you're more familiar with than me. He said, it's not true that Iran is far away from a nuclear bomb. He said, it's not true. He said they could, within about 10 days, construct one. And if if Israel uses theirs, Iran will use theirs. Now, beneath the veneer, the patina of a cool, objective MIT scientist, I inferred, I can't say for sure, that he's Jewish. And because he mentioned at some point that his friends in Tel Aviv were saying how terrible the situation is. And you could see beneath the cool, objective veneer or patina, he was concerned that Israel might cease to exist. So, to return to my point, if I weren't able to speak, I would be deadly serious, because this is a deadly serious moment. This could be the one. I know as of the time we're recording, it doesn't feel it as it felt a few days ago when the Israelis and Americans attacked the nuclear site in Iran, and in return, the Iranians targeted sites in the vicinity of Dimona, and it was pretty scary for somebody like me. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara subsequently estimated that there was a 1/2 to 2/3 possibility at the time that the whole world would be annihilated in the nuclear war. And I remember we were in school, and we had to sit in the corridors on the ground, not in the classroom, on the corridors on the ground, because the reports were that the Russian submarines were heading towards Cuba to break the blockade. And that looked like it. At the last minute, I know there's a lot of new scholarship in the subject. I've not read it. At the last minute, Khrushchev gave the order to turn it around. And that same scariness I felt a few days ago, and I don't know where it'll go tomorrow. It's the Iranians, I don't condemn them, I don't applaud them. I don't want to say this loosely. I'm not sure if they would have given the order to turn around, the one that Khrushchev gave. I think they're ready to go for broke. I don't blame them. I don't want to pass a judgment, but I think we're at a very scary moment, having a clue where things are headed. I don't think anybody knows. I think all of these pundits haven't a clue what they're talking about, frankly, when it comes to military matters. I kind of agree with Tolstoy. If you read War and Peace, he says, in war, there are so many variables. It's impossible to predict where it's going to go and how it's going to end. Too many variables. I kind of think that's true. If you had told me 1 month ago that Iran was going to be firing missiles on Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, if you had told me, you're crazy. Who would thought it would go in? People talked about the Straits of Hormuz. Okay, that was known. I agree. That was a known factor. But the fact that Iran was going to the tit for tat was going to go in a whole new direction. You attack one of our desalinization plants, we're going to attack one in Bahrain. Would I have ever thought that? No. Many variables. there'll be people who will say, well, I predicted that Iran would win in this war. Yeah, but you didn't predict how they would win, that they were going to conduct this war like a chess game with all these pieces on the board called states, which are actually family-owned gas stations. You didn't predict that all these pawns, all these rooks, and all these knights would suddenly become active in this conflict. Yes, we all knew, I'm not saying I predicted anything I did not, we all knew that there would be targeting of the Straits of Hormuz, or that there would be a move there, not targeting, a move made there by Iran, but not the rest. And that became obviously a very significant factor in how things are unfolding. So there are many unknowns, and I have to say, it surprised me, not really totally, the Iranians are very smart. 5,000-year-old civilization, it shows. It shows. They're always, wherever they are, they're very successful. You're from California, so there's an extremely rich Iranian community, very reactionary, very pro-American, anti-regime. In Los Angeles, very successful, very rich, very nasty, I have to say. Again, speak to your scientist side, the first woman to win the Fields Medal, which is the Nobel Prize for Math, was Iranian. 60% of the women 60% of those in higher education, math and science in Iran are women?
I did not know that.
Yeah. I wish we could say that about our advanced progressive society. So I never underestimated them. In some ways, they're like the Soviet Union during the Stalin era. A huge amount of repression at the cultural level, a huge amount of repression at the social level. On the other hand, and very backward, I have to say. I mean, I was to Iran, I can't remember when, probably around 8 years ago. I then got a visit from the FBI saying, you better not go back to Iran.
Really?
Yeah, two gentlemen from the FBI. Actually, I still have their notice they gave me here. But
I guess we're digressing, but on what basis could they tell you not to go back to?
Because they claimed the group that sponsored me. I wasn't in the government-sponsored visit. I was on a private-sponsored visit, and they said that group was a known terrorist organization.
Okay.
So that was their grounds. In any event, so I visited some of their cultural institutions, and it was just really Mickey Mouse. Complete lunacy. And their obsession with things like the Nazi Holocaust, that it didn't happen, and blah, blah, crazy. But I said it was like the Soviet Union, because you know how in our higher education, the sciences and that area, very serious at places like Stanford, Harvard, Caltech, and then the humanities, super flaky. At least since the era of wokeness, became super flaky. Well, the same case in Iran. There was a crazy kind of another kind of flake, not a woke flakiness, another kind of flakiness. However, they carved out the space for the scientists. Just like the Soviet Union, that's how they got the bomb. That's how they got the H-bomb. Because Stalin carved out a space. This is serious business. Leave them alone. No Marxism, Leninism in this room. Because we need the bomb. And the same way in Iran. The serious business, they left to serious people. And I would add something else, and here I only recently became aware. I did meet with the mullahs in QOM, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which is their religious town. Their two main religious towns are Qom and Mashhad. I did meet with their senior intellectuals. Very serious, very smart. And Khamenei, the fellow who they assassinated, he was a classical scholar. He knew poetry very well. He knew literature very well. He's a serious people. So when you watch them now, it's a chess game for them. And what's the American response? The American response is the same every day. Tomorrow, we are going to drop more bombs, and there will be more missions than the day before. And then the next day, and tomorrow, it's just, the expression, every problem is a nail and every solution is a hammer. That's the United States. Just pound, pound, pound. All Trump can say is, we obliterated them. We're going to destroy them, obliterate them. But the Iranians, no, it's not about obliteration. It's very careful. Targeting, not just targeting in a military sense, but targeting in a strategic sense. Which country to target? What facility to target? They are. That's what a weaker party has to do. They can't obliterate, obviously. They have to do other things. So there's what you might call in the Iranian strategy, there's a subtlety and a nuance to it. And it seems to have been very effective. Now, that doesn't mean tomorrow the whole thing might collapse. I know it might. I have to be open to that possibility. But so far, it's been there's no silver lining in a war. And I'm not going to suddenly become a general or a military analyst. There's no silver lining in a war. And it would be a sin on my parents' memory to suddenly become a military commander. But that having been said, there has been a certain, I could only think of the word impressiveness, because Iran is totally isolated. I mean, I've never quite seen it. It's true. Ted Postel for MIT, he was emphatic to the point of certainty. He was saying that the Chinese and the Russians are supplying the Iranians with satellite photography so as to facilitate the targets that they aim at. But that having been said, it's also true that in the Security Council, it's amazing to watch, except for the Russians and Chinese. The Russian, in one of the debates I watched, he said, speaking of the Europeans, he said it's as if they're living in a parallel universe. He said it was as if, through the looking glass, they're blaming Iran for aggression. It's almost laugh. You have to laugh. You're blaming Iran for aggression, and the Europeans are terrified of saying anything against the Americans. Beautiful. So the fact that the Iranians, with the assist now of the Hezbollah, and maybe the Houthis and the Red Sea, they've been able to do this alone. It's impressive. I hate to use the word impressive because nothing about war is impressive. It's I don't know. Tolstoy was a pacifist, but in War and Peace, he just heaps praise and praise and praise on the senior general Kutuzov. Kutuzov, something like that. Do you remember how you pronounce his name? K-U-T, K-U-T-O-Z-O-V, I think. So there was a contradiction in Tolstoy because he clearly respected this old general a great deal. So,
Well, there's a lot on the table now. I think the two biggest directions are what's going to happen going forward, but you've already had a lot to say about why nobody can make really good predictions, but still maybe we'll come back to that later. Then at the beginning of the conversation, you also talked about the history you've been brushing up on. But before we go in either of those two directions, you and I have also, I think we have one episode on this show even called maybe facts and fiction in the Israel-Palestine conflict, something like that. But you've spent a lot of time talking about the justifications that Israel and the United States would have needed to begin this war. And what I want to ask then is what you take to actually be the official Israeli or US line of justification, because they don't want to be pariahs on a global stage. Their lives would be much easier as nations if the rest of the world were happy with what they were doing. So what they take to be their justification and how it actually squares with reality, the claims that they're making.
well, be it in the U.S. Congress or from Israeli spokespeople, when Joe Kent, who looks just like Clark Kent, so it's a very
He does. He
yeah.
does.
Look at Christopher Reeves, and you think it's Joe Kent. The square jaw is I always have to remember to say Joe and not Clark Kent. So when Joe Kent, and I could say a lot if you want about Joe Kent, um, but
I would love to hear, because I
no,
found that very interesting.
okay. But before we get to that, when he submitted his letter of resignation, he stated that there was no imminent threat, military threat emanating from Iran. And of course, that was indisputable because imminent, as it's understood in law, and for the sake of your listeners, Mr. Robinson, my interlocutor right now, is in law school. Imminent has a very specific meaning. It means it's the one wiggle room for Article 51 that says you can only resort to self force and self defense if there is an armed attack. And the little wiggle room that's been granted to that very strict uh, strict text, it has to be an armed attack. Um, so the only wiggle room that has been allowed is what's called a preemptive attack. But to qualify as a preemptive attack, the attack had to be with certainty, inevitability, inexorable, and irreversible. It has to have been an inevitable, irreversible, imminent attack in order to be justified under Article 51. Well, there was nothing there. Nobody claims that except Mr. Trump, and Mr. Trump was actually a little bit, I mean, he was making some tenuous contact with reality. He said, I had a feeling in my gut that there might be an attack in 2 weeks. Well, that's not enough. That's not enough under the law. Whatever your gut feeling was, and frankly, there are few things that interest me less in this world than Donald Trump's guts. It doesn't meet the threshold of Article 51. So how did they get out of it? You asked what was their justification. when Kent said that. And one of the Congress people, he was questioning somebody during a congressional hearing, and he said, "Isn't it true that Iran was building ballistic missiles that might threaten us one day?" And the person who was asking, who was a Trump person, as was the questioner, it was a planted question. He said, "Yes, of course it's true that they were building ballistic missiles." And then the questioner said, the congressperson said, "So Kent was wrong when he said there's no threat of an imminent attack." So imminent was redefined to mean what under international law is called not a preemptive attack, but what's called a preventive war. A preventive war is one in which you anticipate somewhere down the pike there might be a war. In Trump's gut, that was going to be maybe in 2 weeks. And therefore you have the right to launch a war now. That's not an imminent attack. Preventive wars are categorically, absolutely, without equivocation, they're illegal under international law. You can't launch. You know why you can't launch a preventive war? Because any country can claim that any other country might one day in the future, only God knows, want to attack us. If you legitimize preventive wars, then why doesn't India attack Pakistan with a nuclear weapon? Why doesn't Pakistan attack India with a nuclear weapon? Any two countries which suffer hostile relations can use the argument of preventive war to attack their neighbor. So it wasn't just this congressperson. I was on the Piers Morgan program, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. No, it was last week. I was on the Piers Morgan program, and I was debating this guy named Conricus, something like that. And he says the same. I said, look, the war is just a flagrant, blatant, outrageous breach of the UN Charter. I don't believe there's anything been quite like this, because I said, most other countries at least try to fabricate incidents. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, fabricated the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It didn't happen. There was some incident that happened the day before, but the claim for that Gulf of Tonkin, it was not true. It was fabricated. But countries recognize that you have to fabricate. In any case, every other country fabricated an incident to justify. I mean, even for Christ's sake, even Hitler fabricated an incident in the Polish border in 1939. So if you used that standard of imminent, the world would evaporate very quickly. That standard of imminent, meaning preventive war, the world would evaporate. So when I said to Conricus, I said, because Conricus said, we don't have to wait till they get the ballistic missiles. We don't have to wait. And I said, really? We don't have to wait. So let me get this straight. If you listen to people like John Mearsheimer, who's a decent person for sure, he says a war is inevitable between the U.S. and China. That we have to focus our concerns on China because a war with the U.S. a war between the U.S. and China is inevitable. Does that mean we have the right to nuke China? Why should we wait? Mr. Conricus? I remember 1963 when China got the bomb. It detonated a nuclear weapon, an atomic weapon in 1963. I remember. And there were many people in the U.S. administration who said we should nuke China now. And you know what Conricus said?
What?
It gives you deep insight into the Israeli mentality. I'm quoting him. You can bring it up in your screen because you can find it. He said, maybe we should have. You realize what lunatics? It's not an. I disagreed with Postal. I said, no, it's not. The problem is not only that Netanyahu is a homicidal maniac. That's not the only problem. It's a nation of homicidal maniacs. I'm not being facetious. I'm not trying to evoke a smile from you. Benny Morris, a liberal, a typical liberal elite in Israel, he's been advocating using nuclear weapons on Iran for a decade.
Really?
Yes. He
I
says if the U.S. does not support a war to unseat the Iranian regime, then Israel will have to do it on its own using unconventional weapons. This nation of lunatics, this nation of homicidal maniacs, they speak so freely, so easily about annihilating 10. In the case of China, China's population in 1963 was about 600 million. Annihilating 100 million people. They're so blasé about it. He said, yes, go, you find a clip. He said, well, maybe in 63, China should have been nuked. But that's their claim. No claim of an imminent threat, and even Trump had to qualify it. He said, maybe in 2 weeks. But that's not what the law says. I'm not saying the law for the law's sake. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it because the whole purpose of the law is to try to eliminate, as the founding charter of the UN said, the scourge of war. That war, and I heard Gideon Levy say this, the Israeli columnist, who's a decent guy for sure. I was listening to him yesterday, I believe, and he said the problem with Israelis is war is not the last option. He said for Israelis, war is always the first option. Diplomacy is the last option. Actually, diplomacy isn't even an option. Diplomacy is just a facade for the Israelis. It's always just bomb them, annihilate them, obliterate them, destroy them. That's the Israelis. That's why Trump gets along so well with them, because it's his mentality also. They're a type. There was a neoconservative. His name was Michael Ledeen. He recently died. And he said at the time of the Iraq War, this is 2003, every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up a small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall just to show we mean business. Every 10 years or so, you have to pick up a small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall to show we mean business. That's the Israelis. And that's the Trump people also. The ones who revel, thrive, get orgasmic pleasure from, as Trump said, we obliterated them. We obliterate. Who did you obliterate? Babies? You obliterate babies? Children? What did you obliterate? Whose lives did you doubt? Whose lives did you turn the lights off? That's them.
There are 2 points, sort of tangential points that you've brought up that I don't want to lose sight of. I'm curious to hear what you had to say before we move on. And the first was, you said that you didn't believe that Putin's actions in Ukraine were comparable to anything that's going on today, despite what some people might say. So that's one thing that I wanted to ask you about. Maybe we should just start there if you're open to talking about that a bit.
Yeah, I'm open to talking about it. In the case of Putin, you have to understand the context. Putin is my age. That's correct. Putin is my age. His family members, they were killed during World War II. Several family members were killed during World War II. Russia lost 30 million people during World War II. The United States lost about 250,000. The Brits lost about the same number. In the Battle of Leningrad, just Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad, the 800 days, 800 and 900 days, maybe 900. The siege of Leningrad, 1.5 million Russians died in the siege of Leningrad. So
It is
Russia,
just interesting. I mean, before you continue, it is just interesting. Obviously, when I learned this history in high school, in grade school, well, I wasn't the best student in high school and grade school, so I'm sure that these numbers were given to me at some point. But certainly because of the perspective from which it's taught, this U.S. Um, Western Europe centric perspective, you don't really consider the great disparity in losses.
I
Uh,
did either. You know, when I discovered it,
when
I still remember. As you know, when you get older, your long-term memory is much keener than much more acute than your short-term memory. I was in 7th grade. We were doing world history. And in our textbook, back then we had textbooks, in my textbook, there was a bar graph of countries and how many people were killed during World War II. And I see the US, a little bar, 250,000. I see the UK, back then I think the number was 400,000. And then I see the Soviet Union, 70 million. That was a case where a picture was worth, or in this case, a graph was worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
It suddenly dawned on me.
Yeah,
And
okay.
so I think the Soviet Union has a right not to have a hostile military bloc armed with nuclear weapons on its border. I think they have earned that historic right. And I thought and still believe that Russia negotiated in good faith. It simply asked, its aim was that there be no nuclear weapons poised on its border and that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Now, let me be clear. I am not blind to Israelis' concern, because they could say Russia lost 30 million people. We lost half of European Jewry during World War II, the Nazi Holocaust. And I'm not going to pretend as if that's not a trivial fact. That's a trivial fact. It is a significant fact. It's not a trivial fact. I get that. I have no problem with that. But I said Russia was engaged in good faith negotiations. Iran has put forth reasonable proposals. One, leaving the non-proliferation treaty aside, one proposal is completely reasonable. That is, you might or might not be aware, there's what's called a nuclear-free zone in Latin America, meaning no country can acquire nuclear weapons. All the signatories have to agree, no nuclear weapons in Latin America. There's the same treaty in Africa. That's why you don't hear about Latin American countries or African countries acquiring nuclear weapons. There's a treaty. You declare the area. It's called a Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone. WMDFZ, Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone. And there's one in the South Pacific, Australia, Solomon Islands, and so forth, for a good reason, by the way, because that's where the nuclear powers used to test their weapons. And so the South Pacific Islands didn't like that. I can tell you a lot about that, but that would be a digression. Too far a digression. So all the countries in the Middle East agreed, including Iran. Let's create a weapons of mass destruction free zone. If Israel were really concerned about Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons, here's an easy solution. Israel is the one country that refuses to sign it. So I emphasized with the case of Russian Federation, good faith negotiations. Israel's have not been good faith. Israel wants a monopoly on nuclear weapons. It wants everybody else not to have them, but it reserves the right to have them for itself. No, that's not good faith negotiations. That's not good faith negotiations. So I don't believe this. The Russians have been saying, when these idiots talk about Putin's war, what do you mean Putin's war? The Russians have been saying since 1999, no NATO expansion. The entire ruling elite there agrees on that point. There's no dissent within the Soviet ruling elite on the question of NATO expansion to Russia's border. And I think that's a reasonable demand in light of its history. That's a reasonable demand. Israel hasn't negotiated in good faith. Israel wants everybody else not to have nuclear weapons so it can terrorize everybody in the region. I don't think it has that right. By the way, as a very good historian, Israeli historian, Ze'ev Ma'oz pointed out, actually, the strategy never really worked. It wasn't a deterrent. They say keeping the weapon is a deterrent to attack. Has it deterred Iran? Has it? Israel has nuclear weapons. Has that stopped Iran from targeting Tel Aviv? Has it stopped it from targeting the vicinity of Dimona? In 2006, the Hezbollah was targeting Israeli cities. Did Israel's nuclear weapons threat deter them? No. Did it deter Egypt from attacking in 1973, the so-called Yom Kippur War? Did it? No. It's not even true that it works as a deterrent. So you might ask them, why do they keep this weapon if they can't use it? Because, like you said, nobody wants to be an international pariah. And if you use that weapon, you are, internationally, that would have crossed a threshold that hasn't been crossed in 1945, close to 100 years now, 80 years. That's a separate question, which Ma'oz, the historian I mentioned, goes into at great length. But Iran has made all sorts of proposals which are completely consistent with the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's no inconsistency. Nobody even said what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the one that was signed by Obama, the Obama administration. Everybody agrees it was working. Everybody agrees it was working. And why did you pull out? Why did Trump pull out? And then Biden went along with it. Why did you pull out? It was working. There's no dispute about that. So, in general, I think the Iranian record is fine. I see no grounds to put it in the same category as the bad faith demonstrated by Israel. Iran was acting in good faith. Don't ask, you can't prove these things, but as you know, the supreme leader, Khamenei, the fellow who was assassinated, he said for theological reasons he was absolutely opposed to nuclear weapons, and he put a fatwa on it, a prohibition. Uh, we can't acquire nuclear weapons. I don't know how to take that, but they didn't get them, that we know.
Just again, I'm obviously not as well versed in the UN Charter as you are, but is the basic idea that with Article 2, if you have a general or a genuine grievance with another country, maybe one with national security implications, and then you attempt to engage in good faith negotiations, and those negotiations go nowhere, you are justified in using force or can be permissible? How does this work?
Okay, I have to be careful here. First of all, I'm not an expert on the UN or international law, but I've studied it enough, and I teach aspects of it. You can't, the only circumstance, first of all, the UN Security Council is the supreme body for war and peace. It gets the final say. Even if you're acting in self-defense, you're only allowed to act until the Security Council has seized the issue. And then you have to listen to what the Security Council says. The Security Council is the final arbiter on all issues of war and peace. So acting in self-defense is a provisional measure until the Security Council is seized of the question. But other than armed attack, you can't do anything. You can go to the Security Council, you can go to the International Court of Justice, but you can't resort to force.
Okay, so you understand Putin's actions.
But should enter one qualification. Under international law, if you are under foreign domination or colonial domination, then you have a right to use force to achieve your self-determination or statehood. If you are under colonial or foreign occupation, what's called colonial domination or foreign occupation, then you have the right to use force in order to recover your right to statehood and self-determination. Basically, it's a form of, if you have a right of self-defense against a violent and armed attack, that we know under Article 51. And an occupation is considered the extension of an armed attack. And therefore, a colonial people or people under occupation have the right of self-defense against this colonial or foreign domination. But only because it's a form of violent armed attack. A colonial or foreign domination is a form of armed attack. or an extension of it.
The reason that I ask about Article 2 specifically is I'm just trying to better understand your position on Russia's actions toward Ukraine, and it
I
sounds
agree. It's a violation.
okay.
Look. As you know, my credo is never quarrel with facts. So it is. There's no question about that, in my opinion. I would say, though, I make a distinction, and I agree it's not made by everybody. I think there's a distinction to be made between a legal right and a historical right. Just like I kind of agreed, many people don't like me for saying it, but I'll say it. I thought that in 1947, the Israel-Arab conflict is being debated at the United Nations in the General Assembly. And the Foreign Minister, Gromyko, comes up to speak. And he gave what's the most famous presentation during what was called the partition debate. He gave the most famous presentation. What does he say? He says that he wishes that there was a way for the Arabs and the Jews to live together in Palestine. He wishes. And he still hopes. But he says, if there's no way for them to get along, if the differences are so pronounced that there's no way for them to get along, Gromyko says this. Remember, Russia lost 30 million people during World War II. But Gromyko said, and I thought this was a really impressive remark from a very tough guy. He's Stalin's Secretary of State. Well, as I said Gromyko, my memory, no, I can't, no, it's either Gromyko or I think it was Gromyko. It wasn't Molotov. I think it was Gromyko. I've read the speech so many times, now I can't remember. So Gromyko says, I wish and hope they can get along, and still hope they can get along. But if not, he says, nobody during World War II suffered the way the Jews did. Coming from a Russian, that was a very impressive statement. Nobody suffered like the Jews. The suffering was so terrible, what the Jews endured, that he said, if they didn't get along, the Jews should have a right to a state. Now, the state was a flagrant violation of Palestinian self-determination. It was their land. I don't think that's disputable. From the moment the Jewish settlers started to come to Palestine, it was opposed. It wasn't like as if suddenly one night the Palestinian Arabs woke up and said, we don't want Jews here. No, they opposed the creation of a Jewish state in their midst. But, and I get a lot of flack for it, but I can handle the flack. I say, I kind of agree with Gromyko. Given the historical suffering, and if the conflict was, if the parties, there was no possibility of reconciliation between them, I thought there was a historical right there. It was my parents. They walked out of the war with the thought, not illegitimate, though I don't think it was entirely correct, that the whole world abandoned them. Nobody cared about them. The whole world abandoned them, and my mother was very emphatic, even though she like my father, hated the state of Israel. They were both sympathetic to the Palestinians, But my mother would emphatically say, the Jews need a refuge. That was a lesson they drew from the experience. The Jews need a refuge. And I recognize that refuge comes at the expense of the Palestinians. I'm not going to deny that. And I think it was illegal. I don't believe they had a legal right, the Jews, to appropriate a portion of Palestine for themselves. I don't believe they had that legal right. As a legal question, I cannot support it. Like I said with Putin, I know it's illegal. I recognize it, but I do believe there is a relevant notion of a historic right. And just like I admire Gromyko for what he said, when you ask me about Putin and Ukraine, I first have to look at the history. And I can tell you, I know where Putin's coming from. He's my age. And if you go and look in the Wikipedia entry for him, if you go and look at it, you're going to see when they talk about his childhood, the first thing they start talking about is members of his family who were killed during World War II. That's where Putin's life began. And you know what, Mr. Robinson? That's where my life began. So I get it. But I'm not going to pretend that the law says otherwise. Yes, the law says otherwise. It was a breach of the UN Charter. Period, full stop. You're not going to get me to equivocate on that. That's not going to happen.
This distinction between the legal and historical right is very well taken. Since you mentioned the word imminent earlier and stressed it, legally speaking, there's an interesting case that I read in my criminal law course where you had this case where there was a woman and her husband brutally beat her. He raped her. He forced her to prostitute herself. He forced her to eat dog food. She just lived in utter sort of stress and fear of her husband. And one day when I guess she thought that she was going to be killed, like she thought most
Yeah,
days.
she killed him. And then the question is, did he have a right of self-defense?
No, that isn't the question here. She killed him while he was sleeping.
Uh-huh.
And because he was sleeping, there was no imminent risk of her death because he was asleep and he could not have killed her at that time.
Well,
And because there was no imminent risk, she was legally responsible, but the question might be, did she have a moral right or something to what
you
she
know
did?
what? That's very, let's call it prophetic that you made that analogy, because I make it in my book.
Well, you have on our show, you gave me a sort of similar scenario in one episode, but
I'll just read it
sure.
from the forthcoming book. What was Israel to do after 7 October? Didn't it have a right to self-defense? Consider this hypothetical. A woman is battered by her husband, day in and day out, for decades. She lets out shrieks of agony and despair, but the neighbors ignore her pleas. She contacts the police, like the Palestinians went to the UN. After conducting a thorough investigation, the police, they file a devastating report, like the UN filed all those devastating reports of Israel's killing sprees in Gaza. They file a devastating report, but it's left in a desk drawer to collect dust. Or in this case, it's left on my bookshelves to collect dust, all those UN reports condemning Israel. One day, as he approaches her, the battered woman decides to take matters into her own hands. She reaches for a knife and stabs him once, twice, thrice. He grabs his pistol and shoots her dead in self-defense. The wife batterer, I checked with a lot of lawyers on this. The wife batterer would more likely than not be acquitted of murder in a court of law. Legally, he had the right to kill her. But did he have the moral right to kill her? Or did he forfeit the right to self-defense after decades of criminally abusing her? I think he forfeited the right. That's another form of historic right. I don't think he had. Did he have the right to kill her? No, he did not. I don't care what the law says about self-defense. The lawyers say 9 times out of 10 he would be acquitted. I don't think he had a right to kill her.
Yeah. So thank you for explaining the two situations and why you view the one as different from the other. The other sort of digression that I wanted to go on is you said that you had a lot more to say about Joe Kent's statements. The thing that I found most interesting about it actually didn't have anything to do with Iran, and it's just ever since the Epstein scandal, for better or worse, for the quality of my thinking, I've been much more open-minded to conspiracies and conspiracy theories, even though, I mean, giving them that label is pretty pejorative, it sounds like to me. But he implied that he felt that Israel very much could have been behind Charlie Kirk's killing, which I found very, interesting just to hear from somebody that's so high level. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what he has said.
Look, Joe Kent he's an intersection. He himself is not interesting at all, that's for sure. He has raw physical courage. Oh, no, I don't doubt that. There's no question in my mind about that. Last night I was reading Hitler's Mein Kampf for some things I needed to check. Hitler had a lot of raw
I'm
physical
glad you
courage.
added that clarification. It's not your bedtime reading.
Hitler had a lot of raw physical courage. Nobody ever disputed that. He actually thrived in war. The most thrilling moment in his life was when World War I begins. He is orgasmic thrill to be in the war, you know? So raw physical courage, yes, there's an element to be admired in it, in particular because I don't possess it. But as you can see from where I just came, there are limits to how much you can admire it. There are limits to how admirable or overshadowing that quality is. So I'm not going to deny Mr. Kent his raw physical courage. Now, he says a lot of things. He has said a lot of things which are complete nonsense. Time doesn't allow me to go into them now. There's no evidence, and I've studied it very closely. There's no evidence that the U.S. went to war against Iraq at Israel's behest, or that Israel tricked or duped people like Cheney and Rumsfeld, 2 very smart individuals with long experience in government, and they can make errors. In the case of Iraq, they made a colossal error. But tricked and duped? No. That's not in the Cheney or Rumsfeld lexicon. That doesn't happen with them. They can make errors often born of hubris, but not but not being tricked or duped by the Israelis into believing that they were engaged in a war of national interest, which was actually a war of Israeli national interest. That doesn't happen. Period. Full stop. Then he made claims that Hamas was able to dominate the social media during the Gaza genocide. I know the Hamas people. Some of them are very impressive. Don't kid yourself. Bassem Naim, their current international representative, I'm sure you will appreciate. He has 2 PhDs from Germany. I mean, these are not United Arab Emirates PhDs. This is Germany. Very smart guy. I once wrote to him, we're occasionally in correspondence. I said to him, you know what, Bassem Naim, you deserve better in life. You deserve better. And for once, he was actually very candid with me in a human way. And he started to list, I lost my mother in the war. I mean, the genocide, what's happened. I lost my son. I lost him. He lost 2 sons. I said, you deserve better. What do you want me to tell you? 2 PhDs by a Gazan Palestinian in Germany. Very impressive. So, the idea that Hamas dominates, I mean, they barely know the top people. Their publications, with no disrespect towards them, none. But they're so primitive. The English is so basic. And the idea that they can make clever TikTok videos in English on the web, no. Mr. Kent, you're completely out to lunch. The things he's saying, they now say, this group of right-wing MAGA and ex-MAGA types, that Israel was behind the Kennedy assassination. Where are you going? Next, it's going to be Israel was behind the Civil War. Israel was behind the fall of the Roman Empire. It's just so completely lunatic. And they all believe it. I mean, you wouldn't believe the degree of seriousness with which they say things like Israel is behind the Kennedy assassination. You will have noticed, perhaps, that these people, I don't want to name them because I don't want to get into a verbal mudslinging, pissing contest. They will never, except for one of them one time, none of them will let me on their programs. If you think of who are those prominent podcasters, and you think through it, one of them, only one, had me on one time. Because I just don't see eye to eye with them on these basic issues about whether the Jews control America or things like that. So, Kent is an interesting example of one aspect of what happened. As you know, everybody says, left, right, and center, they say, Israel manipulated Trump into this war. He was tricked by the Israelis. He was seduced. Everybody says that, from Tom Friedman to this guy who's a person on the left, Daniel Levy, everyone. It's ridiculous. But there is an element of truth to it, an element. And that's when we come back to Kent. Now, this will take me a little time to explain, and we'll just end it on this, but I think it's an important point to clarify for viewers. Um, Trump, Trump's has been a very personalized presidency, a very eccentric presidency. Uh, it's very hard to demarcate with Trump what you might call the national interest from his personal self-aggrandizement. And that's actually unusual. Most of the US presidents, they did step into office with an element of seriousness. They're here to serve the national interest as defined by the ruling elites. And they had agendas. Carter had his agenda. Reagan had his agenda. Clinton had his agenda. They had very clear agendas of what they wanted to do, not to aggrandize their ego. Of course, they had humongous egos. You don't become president of the United States by being a wallflower. But they had a sense of purpose as the chief executive in our country. And they surround themselves with very serious people. You might not like them, but nobody would seriously doubt Hillary Clinton's competence. Competence. I'm limiting myself to competence. Nobody would seriously doubt Anthony Blinken's competence. I'm not saying moral compass, just competence, raw competence. Same thing for John Kerry, who was, I guess it was Obama's second, or Hillary Clinton was the first, so maybe Kerry was I think the second Secretary of State. And I go back very far. And, the Secretaries of State, Carter's was Cyrus Vance. There was Henry Kissinger. People who were highly competent. That was not Trump. Trump surrounded himself with a bunch of sub-mediocre yes people. Sub-mediocrities, and they were just yes men. The great leader, the great leader, the great leader. So who did he surround himself with? Mark Rubio as Secretary of State. Mark Rubio, when he goes to the toilet, he brings along the GPS to find his anal cavity. He's not a Secretary of State. Then he has Tulsi Gabbard in intelligence, national intelligence. What she knows about national intelligence? No. Not very impressive. Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner looks like he's been on puberty blockers the last 30 years. With his porcelain face. Somebody has to tell Jared to get off the puberty blockers and get some facial hair. Witkoff went to Hofstra University, and his only qualification is he knows the difference between an iron and a wood. He was Trump's golfing partner. And the same thing if you look at the credentials of Joe Kent. I never even heard of the school he went to. He went to Norwich College, which is a military college. And then he's put the head of another intelligence agency. So Trump is smart enough at least to know that all the people he surrounded himself are stupid. And they were all yes men. Oh, great leader. Oh, brilliant. Oh, that. And so basically, in the Trump administration, there was an information void. there was nobody who knew anything. And on top of that, Trump was certain they didn't know anything. That's why he put them there, because he wanted people who made him look good. He doesn't want anyone around him who makes him look bad. So it makes him look good. And that's where the Israelis came in. If Benjamin Netanyahu is anything, he's a good used car salesman. And he filled the information void, and he told Trump this will be an easy win. It'll be a cakewalk. It'll be like Venezuela. And Trump believed it, so I think that tipped the balance. Trump had his own reasons for going into Iran. There was an element of national interest. There was. Hey, guess what? Trump is not the first president who wanted to get rid of the Iranian regime. In case people have a historic memory that goes back beyond a week, in 2003, the whole plan was first Iraq, then Syria, then Iran. So you're telling me that when Rumsfeld and Cheney set that agenda, they were working for the Israelis? They saw toppling Iran as the big Megillah. But they wanted to do it one step at a time. Knock out Iraq, knock out Syria, and then we knock out Iran. So when people say now this war was not in the national interest, it was all cooked up by Netanyahu. But then, by that reckoning, Cheney and Rumsfeld must also have been Israeli agents, because they wanted to attack Iran. That was the plan. The only difference between Israel and the Americans in 2003, Israel started out saying Iran first. And the Americans, the Rumsfeld-Cheney regime, they said Iran last. But they saw attacking Iran as being in the U.S. national interest. Ask yourself, and ask your viewers, or let your viewers ask themselves a simple question. If the Iran war, as of this moment, if it had not gone south, let's say it turned out to be a cakewalk, would anybody be saying that this was Israel's war and it wasn't in the national interest? Or would they have been celebrating it as a great victory for the U.S.? Would Trump be disclaiming responsibility for it if they won, as they hoped to? Would they be disclaiming responsibility and say, no, it's all Israel's? It was all Israel's idea. Would that be what they say? Of course they see it in their national interest. They've always seen it since 1979, when the U.S.-backed regime of the Shah, the Savak torture regime, when it was overthrown, they wanted to get rid of the mullahs. That's why they financed Iraq's attack on Iran that lasted 8 years, because they wouldn't get rid of the Shah, they get rid of the Ayatollah, the mullahs, whatever you want to call them. So I think Trump was acting in his concept of the national interest, and his concept was completely aligned with the American view all along. The difference was Trump thought it would be easy. Now remember, in 2003, Cheney and Rumsfeld thought it would be easy. They were wrong. This time, I believe Trump had his own independent reasons for doing it. They were the national interest, broadly defined, and then there were personal aspects to it. There were positive and negative. Positive, Trump's victory with the Gaza war, his claim to having ended it, and then the UN Security Council on November 18th, 2025. Few people are even aware of it. They gave Gaza to Trump. He was given the deed to Gaza. That's a fact.
That's
And then there was
crazy. I
his,
don't even know what to make of that.
well, it's a fact. I've written on it extensively. And then there was Venezuela. So there's the hubris that comes with that, the sense of invincibility. So that was the positive incentive to going after Iran. And then there was the negative incentive. The debacle of Greenland, very embarrassing. I'm taking it, no question about it, we're taking it, and he had to back off. And then the second big setback, you may have forgotten it already, but I'll immediately jog your memory. The second setback was Minnesota. The sent in all the ice, and miraculously the people resisted, and he had to back off. He had to take them out. Huge embarrassment for him. And so now he wanted to restore his grandeur, this cross between Caesar and Napoleon. And so he wanted to go into Iran. Now, I do believe, let's say hypothetically, I can't prove it, this is speculation. If the Israelis had told him, don't do it, we have a lot of experience in this region. We have a lot of experience with Iran. It's not going to be a cakewalk. Don't do it. I don't think he would have done it. I don't. Because he didn't trust any of the people around him. They only said what he wanted them to say. So there was that informational vacuum. And if the Israelis stepped in and said, don't do it, in my opinion, purely speculative for anyone who is going to say, oh, what does he know? Yeah, it's true. But I think the Israeli intervention, Bibi Netanyahu is nothing if not a talented used car salesman. It tipped the balance. It tipped the balance in that decision. But all the claims being made that Trump was tricked, he was no more tricked than Cheney and Rumsfeld were tricked in 2003. Nobody tricks them. They could be wrong, and they were very wrong, and Trump was wrong, and the Israelis were wrong. But, of course, it was the U.S. national interest. There's always been a national interest in getting rid of Iran under the current leadership. Israel would like to get rid of it altogether, for it to just disintegrate like Libya or Iraq. The U.S. is not there. The U.S. would prefer, as they did in Venezuela, they prefer the coherent government under our control, under our thumb. So I thought Kent was representative of the type of advisors that Trump had assembled around him. Sub-mediocre to begin with, yes men, just saying the great leader, whatever you say is right. And also, he himself had contempt for them. Trump's smart enough, not that he's smart at all, but he's smart enough to know they know nothing. Mark Rubio talking about global politics. No, that doesn't fly. Doesn't. So that's where I think there is a little element that Israel, you could say, played a role in instigating the war. But it was not a case of it wasn't in the U.S. national interest and Israel fooled them. No. That's ridiculous.
Well, Norman, it's great to see you. It's great to talk to you. It's probably epistemically irresponsible of me to do so much of my learning about important topics in conversations like this one with you, as opposed to doing independent, rigorous research, but I'm immensely appreciative that you let me ask you these, what are for you probably very simple, basic questions in front of an audience. So thank you so much for that too.
No, actually, they're not. You asked me at the very beginning, why am I starting to speak now? Because I am concerned that I think things are being said now in chorus, uniformly, across the board, no dissent. It's now become the received wisdom that this is Israel's war and that Trump was tricked. And I just think that's ridiculous. So I thought, maybe it's time to say something.